The wind bit into Arthur's cheeks as he stood on the corner of 5th and Main. It was one of those cold nights that felt like it could freeze the inside of your bones. It's not just the skin outside. He pulled his thin coat tighter around his chest, but it didn't help much. The coat had seen better days probably about 10 years ago, and the stuffing was coming out of the sleeves. But it was all he had. He looked down at his shoes. They were sneakers, once white, now a sad sort of gray-brown color, and the sole on the left foot was starting to come loose. Every time he took a step, it made a soft flap sound against the wet pavement. Asterisk flap. Flap flap. Asterisk, it was an annoying sound, but nobody else seemed to hear it. The people walking past him were in a hurry. They had somewhere to be. They wore thick wool scarves and expensive leather boots that clicked on the ground. They carried bags from fancy stores. They didn't look at Arthur. In a big city, a man in a worn-out coat becomes invisible. It's like a magic trick, except not the fun kind. If you don't look at him, he isn't there. Arthur was used to it. He kept his head down, watching the feet of the rich people hurry by. He wasn't begging, though. He didn't have a cup out for coins. He was just walking. Walking to keep warm. Walking to find a place that didn't feel so lonely. He stopped in front of a large glass window. It was the display window for a restaurant called L'Eclat. Arthur knew this place. Everyone in the city knew this place. It was where the movie stars ate when they were in town. It was where the businessmen with the big suits went to make deals worth millions of dollars. Through the glass, Arthur could see golden lights spilling out onto the sidewalk. It looked warm. It looked safe. Inside, the waiters were moving around like they were dancing. They carried silver trays high above their heads. They wore crisp white shirts and black boaties. Everything looked clean. Everything looked perfect. But it wasn't the food that made Arthur stop. It was what was sitting in the corner of the room, hidden slightly by a tall fern plant. It was a piano. Arthur leaned closer to the glass, his breath making a foggy patch on the cold surface. He wiped it away with a sleeve that had a small hole in the elbow. There it was. A grand piano. It was black and shiny, reflecting the light of the room. Even from outside, through the thick glass, he could feel the pull of it. It looked like it was sleeping, waiting for someone to wake it up. Arthur closed his eyes for a second and listened. Inside his head, he could hear the music it would make. He could feel the smooth, cool ivory keys under his fingertips. He knew exactly what he would play if he ever sat there, but he knew that would never happen. Men like him didn't sit at L'Eclat. Men with flapping sneakers didn't touch the keys of a grand piano. His stomach gave a loud, angry growl. It was loud enough that a woman passing by jumped a little and gave him a look that was half pity, half fear. She pulled her bag closer and walked faster. Arthur ignored her. He was hungry. He was hungry enough that his head felt a little light, and his hands were shaking a tiny bit. He needed something. A coffee. Just a hot cup of coffee would be enough. It would warm him up and stop the shaking. He looked at his reflection in the window. He looked tired. His hair was messy and his face was unshaven. He looked like what he was, a man who had been having a very hard time. But he looked at his hands. They were dirty, sure, but they were long and slender. Pianist hands. That was what his old teacher used to say. "You have the hands of a pianist, Arthur," she would say. That was a lifetime ago. Before the world got hard, before he lost everything. Arthur took a deep breath. The cold air filled his lungs, sharp and stinging. He looked at the door to the restaurant. It was a heavy wooden door with a brass handle. A man in a uniform stood next to it, opening it for the people who looked like they belonged. The man didn't look like he would open the door for Arthur, but Arthur had a crazy idea. It was the kind of idea that comes when you are so hungry and so tired that you just stop caring about being embarrassed. He had a talent. He had something he could trade. He didn't have money. He didn't have a credit card with a gold limit on it. But he had music. "I can play," he whispered to himself. The sound of his own voice sounded strange in the quiet street. He looked at the piano and sighed again. It was silent. The musicians were probably on a break. The room was full of people laughing and talking, but there was no music. It needed music. It felt empty without it, no matter how expensive the food was. Arthur made a decision. He pushed his hands deep into his coat pockets to warm them up. He rubbed his fingers together, trying to get the blood moving. He needed his fingers to be loose. If they were stiff, he wouldn't be able to play the fast parts. He took one last look at his reflection, fixed his posture so he stood up a little straighter, and turned toward the door. The walk to the door felt like the longest walk of his life. It was only 10 feet, but it felt like a mile. With every step, his heart beat a little harder. Thump thump. Thump thump. It was so loud he was sure the people inside could hear it. The man at the door looked at him as he approached. The guard's eyes went from Arthur's messy hair to his scuffed shoes and then up to his face. The guard's face changed. It went from neutral to suspicious. He took a step forward, putting his hand on the door handle as if to block it. "Reservation?" the guard asked. His voice was deep and serious. Arthur swallowed hard. His throat felt dry. He could feel the heat from inside the restaurant rushing out the open door. Smelling like roast beef and fresh bread and expensive perfume. It smelled like a different world. His voice came out squeaky, so he cleared his throat and tried again. No reservation. He looked past the guard into the room full of golden light and chandeliers. The lights were low and glowy, making everyone look beautiful. The chandeliers sparkled like frozen stars. It was beautiful. "Then I'm sorry, sir," the guard said, starting to close the door. "Private establishment."
Arthur didn't move.
He put his hand out, gently stopping the door from closing all the way. The guard looked down at Arthur's hand, which was still dirty from the street. I'm not here to eat," Arthur said quickly. He knew he had to say it before the guard pushed him away. He looked over at the piano in the corner. The guard followed his eyes. "I see the piano is empty," Arthur said. He tried to make his voice sound confident, even though his knees were shaking a little bit. I play very well. I just want to play for a coffee. Just one cup of coffee? That's all." The guard blinked. He looked at Arthur, then at the fancy people sitting at the tables near the window, then back at the piano. He let out a short, sharp laugh. It wasn't a mean laugh, really. It was just the laugh of someone who hears something ridiculous you want to play. The guard asked, raising an eyebrow. "Here, yes," Arthur said. "Just one song." "For a coffee," the guard shook his head. "Look, friend, this isn't a street corner. We have a guy who comes in at 9. He wears a tuxedo. He went to Juilliard. Do you know where Juilliard is?" Arthur nodded slowly. "I know where it is." The guard sighed. "Go on. Get out of here before the manager sees you. I'm trying to do you a favor." But Arthur didn't move. The warmth of the room was calling him. The coffee was calling him. And the piano. The piano was screaming his name. He stood his ground on the fancy doormat. He looked at the guard, and for a second, he forgot about his dirty coat and his flapping shoe. He just looked like a man who wanted to play. "So let me try," Arthur said. "If I'm bad, I'll leave. I promise." A small group of people were waiting behind Arthur to get in. They were dressed up for a night out. They were listening to the conversation. One man, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Arthur made in a year, chuckled. "Hey!" the man in the suit said to his wife, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Maybe we should let him play. It's good to be good for a laugh." His wife giggled behind her hand. The guard looked at the line of people, then back at Arthur. He hesitated. He saw something in Arthur's eyes. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was certainty. "Fine," the guard said, stepping aside but keeping his hand near his radio. "Go ask the Mater D. He's at the podium. If he says no, you're out in 10 seconds. Understand?" "Thank you," Arthur whispered. He took a breath, stepped across the threshold, and walked into the glowy light. The door clicked shut behind him, cutting off the wind. The noise of the restaurant wrapped around him, clinking glasses. Soft jazz music from the speakers, the murmur of conversations. He walked toward the podium, feeling hundreds of eyes on him. He felt like he was walking on a tightrope without a net. But he kept walking, straight toward the piano. The walk to the front podium felt longer than the entire walk Arthur had just taken outside. Even though the floor was covered in a thick, soft red carpet that silenced his footsteps, he felt heavy. The air inside was different. It wasn't just warm. It was thick with the smell of roasted garlic, expensive perfume, and old wood. It was the smell of money. Arthur kept his eyes forward, trying not to stare at the tables he passed. At the table to his left, a man was cutting into a steak that was probably bigger than Arthur's dinner would be if he ate for a week. At the table to his right, a woman was laughing, her diamond necklace catching the light from the chandeliers above, sending little sparkles dancing across the white tablecloth. They looked like they were in a movie, and Arthur felt like the ghost who had wandered onto the set by mistake. He reached the podium where the head waiter was standing. This man was tall and very thin. He had a perfectly shaped mustache and was wearing a tuxedo that looked like it had been painted onto him. He was organizing some menus, moving them very precisely until they were exactly in line with the edge of the wood. The waiter looked up. His eyes traveled down from Arthur's messy hair, past the dirty coat, and all the way to the flapping sneaker. The waiter's nose wrinkled just a little bit, like he had smelled something sour. He didn't say hello. He just raised one eyebrow, waiting. Arthur swallowed again. His mouth was so dry his tongue felt like sandpaper. He clasped his hands together to stop them from shaking. He could feel the sweat on his palms. "Excuse me," Arthur said. He had to raise his voice a little because the restaurant was noisy. "I saw the piano in the corner." The waiter sighed, a long, tired sound that seemed to deflate his entire chest. He turned his body slightly, blocking Arthur's view of the dining room, as if trying to hide him from the other guests. "Sir, this is a private restaurant. We do not allow soliciting. If you are looking for a meal, there is a shelter 3 blocks east on 4th Street. "I'm not asking for money," Arthur said quickly. He knew he had to get the words out before the waiter called security. "I'm not begging. I play music. I saw the piano. It looks like a beautiful instrument." The waiter looked over at the piano, then back at Arthur with a smirk. "It is a Steinway, sir. It costs more than most houses. It is not a toy." "I know," Arthur said. He took a small step closer, lowering his voice. "I used to play. A long time ago. I saw that the musician isn't here right now. The bench is empty." He looked at the waiter, trying to make eye contact, trying to make him see a human being instead of a beggar. "If you let me play one song, just one. I don't want cash. I just want a cup of coffee. A small one. That's all?" The waiter laughed. It was a sharp, barking sound that made a few people at the nearest table turn their heads. "You want to play the Steinway for a cup of coffee?" The waiter shook his head. "Sir, we have a world-class pianist coming in at 9 o'clock. He is flown in from New York. He does not play for coffee. He plays for applause. Just want to play," Arthur repeated. His voice was quieter now, but it was steady. "Please, just let me sit down. If it sounds bad, I will leave. You won't even have to tell me to go. I'll know." A couple had walked up to the podium to pay their bill. They were an older man and a younger woman, dressed in velvet and silk. They stopped and listened. The man looked at Arthur with a frown, but the woman looked amused. She touched the man's arm and whispered something, pointing at Arthur's shoes. The waiter saw them watching. He seemed to grow an inch taller, puffing out his chest. He wanted to look like he was in charge. "Look around you, sir," the waiter said, waving a hand in a circle that encompassed the golden lights, the crystal chandeliers, and the people drinking wine. "Does this look like the kind of place where people play for tips?" "I don't want tips," Arthur said. "I'm cold. I'm hungry. I just want to warm up my hands and play." The waiter leaned over the podium, getting into Arthur's face. His voice was hard now, no longer polite. "You are dirtying our carpet. You are disturbing our guests. Please leave before I am forced to call the police." "Let him play," a voice called out. It was the younger woman in the velvet dress. She was smiling, holding a glass of white wine. She looked at Arthur like he was a cute puppy that had wandered in. "I'm bored, darling," she said to the man she was with. "It might be fun to see what he can do. It's better than waiting for the check." The waiter froze. He looked at the woman, then back at Arthur. He didn't want to upset a customer, especially one who was wearing a necklace that probably cost $50,000. but he also didn't want a homeless man ruining the atmosphere of his restaurant. "Madam," the waiter said smoothly, "he is not a professional. He will likely ruin the ambiance." "Then we can laugh about it," the woman said, taking a sip of her wine. "Go on. Let the poor man play. If he's terrible, we'll throw him out." Another man at a nearby table, a large man with a red face and a loud laugh, joined in. "Yeah, let him play. I could use a good joke tonight. Let's see if he knows chopsticks." A ripple of laughter went through the nearby tables. It wasn't a nice laughter. It was the laughter people make when they feel safe and superior, laughing at someone they think is below them. Arthur felt his face get hot. He knew they were laughing at him. They expected a clown. They expected him to sit down, bang his fists on the keys, and make a fool of himself. That was the entertainment they wanted. The waiter looked at the large man, then at the woman, and finally at Arthur. He sighed again, defeated by the customers. He picked up a menu and snapped it shut. "Fine," he said, his voice cold. "One song. Do not touch the food. Do not speak to the guests. And if you touch a single key wrong, I will personally drag you out by that ragged collar of yours." He pointed a long finger toward the corner. "Go." Arthur didn't wait. He nodded once, a short, sharp movement. He turned and walked toward the piano. The laughter followed him like a shadow. He could feel eyes on his back. He could hear the whispers. "Look at him," someone whispered. "He's going to get grease all over the bench. Bet you $10 he falls off the stool." Another voice giggled. Arthur kept his head down. He walked past tables filled with beautiful people holding silver forks. They looked like giants to him, powerful and happy. He felt small. He felt like the scruffy dog that everyone shoos away. But as he got closer to the piano, the noise in the room seemed to fade away, just a little bit. There it was. The black Steinway dot up close. It was even more beautiful than it looked through the window. The black lacquer was so shiny he could see his own reflection in the side of it. It was curved and elegant, like a sleeping black swan. The gold petals at the bottom gleamed under the warm lights. Arthur reached the bench. It was upholstered in black leather. He stopped and looked at his hands. They were shaking more than ever now. His fingers were stiff from the cold. He rubbed them against his pants frantically, trying to get the blood moving, trying to warm them up. He could feel the entire room watching him. The waiters had stopped moving. The diners had put down their forks. The laughter had quieted down to a murmur. They were all waiting. They were waiting for the joke to start. They were waiting for the homeless man to make a fool of himself so they could feel better about their own perfect lives. Arthur looked at the keys. 88 black and white keys waiting for him. He thought about the cold wind outside. He thought about the empty stomach growling inside him. He thought about the lonely apartment he used to have, the one he lost. He thought about the piano teacher who told him he had magic in his fingers. He took a deep breath. He closed his eyes for just a second and told himself to forget them. Forget the waiters. Forget the laughter. Forget the velvet dress and the expensive wine. This wasn't for them. This was for the music. This was for him. Arthur sat down on the bench. It was firm and comfortable. He lifted his hands. They were still trembling, but as he hovered them over the keys, something strange happened. The trembling stopped. His hands suddenly looked like they belonged there. The dirty sleeves of his coat rested on the white keys. But his fingers were poised and ready. The silence in the corner was heavy. You could hear a glass clinking 3 tables away. Arthur placed his left foot on the gold pedal. He flexed his fingers one last time. The waiter was standing 5 feet away, his arms crossed, a look of disgust on his face. The large man with the red face was holding his breath, ready to shout. Arthur didn't look at them. He looked only at the music in his head. He took one final breath, held it, and then his right hand came down. He didn't play a clumsy note. He didn't bang on the keys. His fingers struck the ivory with a sudden sharp precision. A single, crisp chord rang out, cutting through the ambient noise like a knife. It was loud and clear. It was a sound that demanded attention. The man with the red face choked on his drink. The waiter's eyes widened, And then, before the chord could fade away, Arthur's left hand joined in. The room went completely silent. No more whispers. No more giggles. The magic was about to begin. The very first note that Arthur struck seemed to hang in the air like a heavy stone dropped into a still pond. It wasn't a soft note. It was bold, loud, and demanding. It silenced the low murmur of conversation at the tables nearest to the piano instantly. Arthur didn't hesitate. He didn't give himself time to get nervous. As soon as his fingers touched the ivory keys, something inside him switched on. It was like a light bulb flickering to life in a dark basement. His left hand moved down the keyboard, finding the deep, booming bass notes, while his right hand scrambled up to the high, tinkling trebles. The song he chose was fast. It was a complicated, swirling piece of music that required fingers to move like spiders. For the first 10 seconds, the restaurant was frozen. The waiter stopped polishing glasses. The man with the red face stopped wiping wine from his chin. Everyone was waiting for the crash. They were waiting for the homeless man to hit a wrong note, to prove that he didn't belong, to justify their laughter. But the crash didn't come. Arthur's fingers were flying. The sound that filled the room wasn't the clumsy banging of a novice. It was a torrent of beautiful, precise sound. The piano, which had been sitting silently like a piece of furniture only moments ago, suddenly came alive. It was growling and singing under Arthur's hands. The notes were clean and sharp, cutting through the smell of the perfume and the food. The waiter, who had been so rude earlier, took a step back. He was still standing with his arms crossed, but his face was changing. The sneer was sliding away, replaced by a look of pure confusion. He looked at Arthur's dirty coat, then at the man's hands moving blurred speed over the keys. It didn't make sense. How could someone who looked like he slept in a dumpster play like this? Arthur was lost in the music now. He wasn't thinking about the people watching him. He wasn't thinking about the coffee. In his head, he wasn't in a luxury restaurant anymore. He was back in his small apartment years ago before everything went wrong. He remembered the feeling of warmth, the feeling of having a future. He poured all those old memories into the keys. He played his hunger into the music. He played his anger at the cold wind. He played his loneliness until the room vibrated with it. The music was telling a story. It started out frantic and fast, like a man running from a storm. Then it slowed down. The heavy crashing notes turned into something softer, sadder. The melody became sweet and mournful. Weeping through the high strings of the piano, the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted completely. The glowy lights overhead seemed to dim in sympathy with the music. The clinking of silverware against plates had stopped entirely. No one was eating anymore. Every single person in the room had turned their chair toward the corner. Even the people in the back, who couldn't see the piano clearly, stopped talking. The sound carried over the booths, wrapped around the golden pillars, and settled in their chests. It was the kind of sound that made you stop breathing for a second. It was human. It was raw. The woman in the velvet dress had set her wine glass down. She wasn't smiling anymore. She was staring at Arthur with wide eyes, her lips slightly parted. She was watching his face. Arthur's eyes were closed, his head tilted slightly to the side. He looked peaceful, transported. He didn't look like a beggar anymore. With the light from the chandeliers reflecting off his face and his posture straight and tall, he looked like a king. The large man with the red face sat back in his chair. He looked foolish now for laughing. He wiped a hand over his mouth, his eyes fixed on the pianist. You could see the realization dawning on his face. He had judged a book by its cover, and he had been wrong. The shame was written all over his red features. Arthur moved into the bridge of the song. The complexity increased. His left hand was jumping up and down the keyboard in a rhythm that made your heart beat faster. It was a technical masterpiece. Most musicians would struggle to play it with that kind of precision, but Arthur made it look easy. His fingers knew exactly where to go. They had danced this dance 1,000 times before. The sound filled every empty space in the room. It bounced off the crystal glasses and the polished silver. It soaked into the red carpet. It was louder than the traffic outside. It was louder than the city itself. For those few minutes, The class barrier that existed between the diners and Arthur vanished. There was no rich or poor, no clean or dirty. There was only the music. The music was a great leveler. It didn't care that Arthur's shoes were flapping or that he hadn't showered in a week. The music was pure truth, and everyone in the room felt it. A young waiter, who had been standing near the kitchen door, whispered to another, "Who is that?" The other waiter shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but he's incredible." At the front of the room, the head waiter finally uncrossed his arms. He let them hang loosely at his sides. He wasn't watching the crowd anymore. He was watching Arthur's hands. He was a professional. He knew quality when he saw it. He could see the control Arthur had over the instrument. He could see the years of practice hidden in the dirty sleeves. For the first time, he looked at Arthur not as a nuisance, but as an artist. Arthur's foot pressed down on the sustain pedal, holding a long, deep chord that resonated through the floorboards. The vibration could be felt in the furniture. It was a dramatic pause. The whole room seemed to lean forward, waiting. Holding their collective breath, the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The music was building again, rising like a wave, getting ready to crash. Arthur's fingers were trembling slightly now, not from cold, but from the sheer physical effort of playing so hard. He was pouring everything he had left into this one performance. This was his only shot. He knew that when he stopped playing, the magic spell would break, and he would just be a beggar again. So he played harder. He made the piano sing louder. The rich, complex harmonies swirled together, creating a wall of sound that surrounded the diners. The couple at the table near the piano stopped holding hands and just stared. The businessman in the expensive suit put down his phone, which he had been checking obsessively all night. The device sat there, dark and ignored, while Arthur played. The music was sad, but it was also beautiful. It was the sound of a fallen angel. It was the sound of hope that wouldn't die. It made people think of things they hadn't thought of in years-old dreams. Lost loves, the feeling of being young. Arthur didn't open his eyes. He didn't want to see them. He didn't want to see if they were laughing or bored. He just wanted to give the piano everything he had. He felt a tear slide down his cheek, but he ignored it. He let his fingers fly across the keys, playing the final, intricate run that led toward the end. The notes cascaded down the scale like waterfalls, rushing toward the conclusion. The tempo was speeding up faster and faster, driving the hearts of everyone in the room to beat in time with the rhythm. The restaurant was no longer a place of business. It was a concert hall. The air was electric. The magic was complete. Arthur wasn't just a man asking for coffee anymore. He was the master of the room, and they were all his captive audience. He took a deep breath, his fingers hovering for a split second over the keys, preparing for the final thundering chords that would end the song. Arthur slammed his hands down for the final chord. It wasn't just a sound. It was an explosion. The deep, resonant boom of the piano seemed to shake the very floorboards of the restaurant. For a second, the note hung in the air, vibrating against the crystal glasses and the gold trim on the walls. It was a sound that demanded you stop whatever you were doing and just listen. Then, Arthur lifted his hands off the keys. He pulled them back quickly like he was touching a hot stove, and dropped them into his lap. The ringing sound faded away slowly, melting into the silence of the room. For the first few seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. It was as if Arthur had pressed a pause button on the entire world. The restaurant was dead silent. You couldn't hear the clinking of forks, the hum of the refrigerators from the kitchen, or even the traffic outside. It was just complete and total stillness. The magic of the music was still floating in the air. Wrapping itself around the golden lights and the expensive tables, Arthur sat there on the bench, his shoulders rising and falling as he caught his breath. He kept his eyes closed for a moment, letting the quiet settle. He felt drained. He had poured every drop of energy he had left into that song. He was exhausted, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the cold in his bones. He felt a warm fire burning inside him. Slowly, he opened his eyes. He expected to see the Mater D standing there, angry, telling him to get out. He expected to see the patrons sneering or going back to their meals, forgetting about the homeless man who had interrupted their dinner. He prepared himself to stand up and walk back out into the wind, but that is not what he saw. The head waiter was still standing by the podium, but he wasn't checking his watch. His arms were hanging loosely at his sides. His mouth was open just a little bit. He looked like he had seen a ghost. The arrogance was gone from his face, replaced by a look of total shock. He was staring at Arthur's hands, the dirty, trembling hands that had just created something beautiful. At the nearest table, the large man with the red face was frozen. He had put his napkin down on the table. The look of mockery he wore earlier had vanished completely. Now he just looked stunned. He looked at the piano, then at Arthur, and then back at the piano, as if trying to figure out how the trick was done. Arthur shifted his weight on the bench. The squeak of the leather seemed to break the spell. From the back of the room, a man stood up. He was older, wearing a dark suit that looked simple, but very expensive. He didn't clap at first. He just looked at Arthur with serious eyes and nodded once. It was a nod of respect. It was the kind of nod you give a soldier or a master. Then it started. The woman in the velvet dress began to clap. At first, it was a slow, rhythmic clapping. Smack, smack, smack. Then the man next to her joined in. Then the couple by the window. Within moments, the quiet room erupted. It wasn't polite applause. It was loud, chaotic noise. People started standing up. One by one, like a wave moving across the room, the diners left their seats. The businessmen in suits stood up. The couples on dates stood up. Even the waiters stopped polishing glasses and started clapping their hands together. They were giving him a standing ovation. Arthur sat on the bench, blinking rapidly. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. These people, the ones who had ignored him on the street, the ones who had laughed at his shoes, the ones who lived in a world of gold and velvet, were on their feet for him. They were cheering for a man in a tattered coat. The sound was overwhelming. It rushed over him like a warm ocean wave. It washed away the shame of the afternoon. It washed away the memory of the cold wind. For the first time in years, Arthur felt like he was seen. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't a nuisance. He was Arthur the pianist. He looked out into the crowd. The woman who had giggled behind her hand was clapping enthusiastically now, her eyes shining with tears. She wasn't laughing at him anymore. She was feeling the music he played. The large man with the red face was whistling a loud, sharp whistle that pierced the applause. Arthur felt a lump forming in his throat. He tried to swallow it down, but it stayed there. He felt a hot tear prick at the corner of his eye, threatening to spill over. He wiped it away quickly with his dirty sleeve, embarrassed to be crying in front of all these rich people. He didn't want them to see him weak. He wanted them to see him strong, like the music he played. The Mater D walked toward him. The crowd parted to let him through. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked humble. He walked up to the piano and stopped a few feet away, waiting for the noise to die down. The applause slowly faded, but people remained standing. They were looking at Arthur, waiting for him to do something. They didn't want him to leave, young man, the head waiter said. His voice wasn't cold or sharp. It was soft, almost kind. That was extraordinary. Arthur looked down at his hands in his lap. He rubbed his thumb over his fingertips. They were sore, but they felt good. Thank you, he whispered. His voice was hoarse. The waiter cleared his throat. I have worked in this restaurant for 20 years, he said loud enough for the people nearby to hear. I have heard many players, professionals, famous names. But none of them played with that kind of heart. A murmur of agreement went through the crowd. Arthur stood up slowly. His legs felt a little wobbly, like jelly. He smoothed down the front of his coat, trying to make himself look decent, even though it was a hopeless task. He looked around the room. He didn't know what to do. Should he bow? Should he just leave? I told you, Arthur said softly, looking at the waiter. Just one song. I'll go now. He turned to step away from the piano. The spell was breaking. The music was over, and the real world was coming back. He had to go back outside. he had to go back to the cold. But just as he took a step, a voice came from the corner of the room. Wait, it was the older man in the dark suit, the one who had nodded first. He walked toward Arthur. The crowd moved aside for him, like he was Moses parting the sea. He stopped right in front of the piano, looking Arthur up and down with a gaze that was sharp but not unkind. "You are not leaving," the man said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. "I have to," Arthur stammered. "I don't belong here." The man shook his head. He gestured around the room at the glowing lights and the crystal chandeliers. "You belong here more than anyone else in this room right now. We buy this luxury with money. You just paid for it with your soul." Arthur didn't know what to say to that. He just stood there, his mouth slightly open. The older man turned to the waiter. "Get this man a coffee," he commanded, "and bring him a meal. A hot meal, and put it on my tab. The best meal you have, and find him a better coat," the woman in the velvet dress called out from her table. "I think I have a scarf in my bag, too." The waiter nodded immediately. "Right away, sir." He turned to Arthur, and for the first time, there was a genuine smile on his face. "Please sit down. You can sit at the bar, or, if you prefer, you can stay at the piano. We would be honored if you played more, but only if you want to." Arthur looked at the piano. Then he looked at the people standing around him. They weren't looking at him with pity anymore. They were looking at him with admiration. They saw the talent, not the dirt. "I could play more," Arthur said slowly. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. It felt strange to smile. His facial muscles felt rusty. "But I really would like that coffee first." The whole room laughed. It was a good laugh. It was a laugh that included him. The large man with the red face slapped his hand on the table and shouted, "A drink for the pianist, and keep them coming." Arthur walked away from the piano bench. As he passed the waiter, he didn't move to the side. He didn't lower his head. He walked with his back straight, led by the waiter to a small table near the window. He sat down on a plush chair that felt softer than a cloud. A few moments later, a cup was placed in front of him. It was white china, delicate and thin. Steam was rising from it, curling into the air. It smelled rich and dark. Arthur wrapped his cold, dirty hands around the warm cup. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, inhaling the smell. He felt the warmth seeping into his fingers, thawing them out. He wasn't on the street anymore. He wasn't invisible. He was a musician. He was an artist. And tonight, inside this glowing room with the crystal lights, he was finally home. The coffee in the white cup was the best thing Arthur had ever tasted. It was hot, strong, and bitter, and it felt like liquid gold running down his throat and warming his stomach. He held the cup with both hands, letting the warmth soak into his palms, chasing away the numbness that had been there for hours. For a while, he just sat there. He sat at the small table near the window, watching the steam rise up in little swirls. Outside, the world was still dark and cold, the wind howling around the corners of the building, but inside, it was peaceful. The golden lights from the chandeliers sparkled softly above him, reflecting off the polished silverware on the empty tables around him. It felt like a dream. A young waiter, not the head waiter, but a younger man with kind eyes, brought a plate of food and set it down gently in front of Arthur. It was a simple meal: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans, but it looked like a feast. There was even a small roll of warm bread on the side. "Compliments of the house," the young waiter said with a shy smile. Arthur looked up at him. "Thank you," Arthur said. "Really?" "Thank you," the waiter said. "You earned it." Arthur didn't need to be told twice. He picked up his fork and took a bite. The flavors exploded in his mouth. It was so good that he had to close his eyes for a second. He hadn't eaten a hot meal like this, and he couldn't remember how long. For a few minutes, the only sound at the table was the clinking of the fork against the china. It was the sound of life coming back into a body that had been running on empty as he ate. The people in the restaurant began to go back to their own conversations, but the mood had changed. The air wasn't stiff and snobbish anymore. It was warmer, more relaxed. People were smiling more. They were talking about the music he had played, Arthur could hear bits of their conversations as he finished his chicken. "Did you see his hands?" a woman whispered a few tables away. "They moved so fast. I've never seen anything like it." "It was the way he played the quiet parts," a man replied. "It was like he was telling us a secret." Arthur felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. They were talking about him. They were respecting him. It was a strange feeling. He had spent so long being invisible, trying not to be seen, that being the center of attention felt overwhelming, but in a good way. He felt like a flower that had finally opened up to the sun. He wiped his mouth with the linen napkin and leaned back in his chair. He was full. For the first time in a long time, the ache in his stomach was gone. He looked toward the corner where the piano sat. It was silent again, waiting. The black wood shone under the lights, looking majestic and proud. Arthur stood up. He walked over to the piano again. His steps were slower now, less shaky. The waiters watched him, but nobody tried to stop him. Nobody asked for a reservation. He sat back down on the leather bench. It still held a little bit of his warmth from before. He placed his fingers on the keys. He didn't start with a loud bang this time. He started soft. He played a gentle, flowing melody. It was a lullaby, something sweet and soothing. The room quieted down again, but in a different way. Before, they had been waiting to see if he was good. Now, they were just listening to enjoy. The music floated through the air, mixing with the smell of coffee and dessert. It was like the restaurant was breathing with the music. He played for an hour. Maybe two. He lost track of time. He played old songs, sad songs, happy songs. He played from memory, drawing from a deep well of music that he had stored up inside him for years. Every time he finished a song, there was polite applause, sometimes a few cheers, but mostly there was just a deep, appreciative silence. It was the silence of people who knew they were witnessing something special. Eventually, Arthur's hands began to get tired. His fingers, stiff from the cold earlier, were now starting to ache. He knew he couldn't play forever. He played one last chord, a soft, fading sound that drifted away into silence. He lifted his hands and stood up. He felt peaceful. He had done what he came to do. He had played, and he had been heard. The head waiter walked over to him. This time, he didn't have his arms crossed. He held something in his hand. It was an envelope. "You have a gift," the waiter said. "A rare gift." "Thank you for letting me play," Arthur said. "And for the coffee?" "Wait," the waiter said, handing him the envelope. Arthur hesitated, then took it. It felt thick. "There is some money in there, tips. A lot of people wanted to give you something. They didn't want to insult you by throwing coins. So we collected it." Arthur opened the envelope just a little bit. He saw bills. A lot of bills. His eyes widened. It was more than enough money for a hotel room. It was enough for hot meals for a week. He looked up at the waiter, shocked. "I don't know what to say," Arthur stammered. "Don't have to say anything," the waiter said. "You earned it." But the waiter wasn't done. He looked nervous for a second, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Also," he said, clearing his throat, "the owner, the older gentleman over there, he asked me to ask you something." Arthur followed the waiter's gaze. The older man in the dark suit was sitting at his table watching them. "Says he is looking for a pianist," the waiter continued. "Our regular guy, the one from New York, he is leaving next month to go on tour." The owner was wondering if you would be interested in the job. Permanent. 3 nights a week? Arthur stood frozen. The job here? At La Clotte. He looked from the waiter to the piano and then down at his dirty coat and his sneakers. He remembered the cold wind outside. He remembered the hunger. He remembered the feeling of being invisible. He thought about waking up in a warm bed. He thought about coming to this beautiful room and playing music for people who actually listened. He thought about having a purpose again. A smile slowly spread across Arthur's face. It was a genuine smile this time, reaching all the way to his eyes. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I would like that. Very much." The waiter smiled back and nodded. "I will tell him." Arthur walked over to the older man. He wanted to shake his hand, but he hesitated. remembering his hands were still a bit dirty. The older man stood up, reached out, and shook Arthur's hand firmly. He didn't care about the dirt.
Oh.
"Welcome to the family," the man said. Arthur thanked him again and again. Then, clutching the envelope of money tightly in his hand, he walked toward the door. The waiters said goodbye to him. The diners nodded. He wasn't a stranger anymore. He was part of the night. He pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped outside. The wind hit him immediately, cold and biting. It was freezing. The street was dark and empty. But Arthur didn't shiver. He didn't feel the cold the way he had before. He looked down at his shoes. They were still the same old sneakers, beat up and flapping. His coat was still thin and worn. He hadn't suddenly become rich or famous, but he had something else. He had his dignity back. He had hope. He started walking down the street, but this time, he wasn't walking to find a warm vent to sleep near. He was walking toward a hotel. A real hotel with a bed and a shower. He walked with his head up, watching his breath puff out in the cold air in little white clouds. He thought about the piano, sitting inside the warm room, waiting for him. He thought about the music still swirling around in his head. He put his hand in his pocket and touched the thick envelope. Arthur began to whistle a soft tune as he walked. It was the melody he had played earlier. The notes drifted down the empty street, light and happy, chasing away the shadows. For the first time in a long time, the night didn't seem scary. The night seemed full of possibilities. And the man who nobody saw, the man who was invisible, walked through the city like he was the most important person in the world because tonight he was